At 52, I had built a life of careful choices and measured steps. Marriage at 23, 2 children raised with devotion, a home maintained with precision, everything in its proper place. Passion felt like a luxury I'd never afforded myself. Instead, I chose security, comfort, the familiar rhythm of days that folded into one another like sheets in a linen closet. But I was wrong about so many things. What happened that summer taught me that life doesn't ask permission before. It transforms you. Don't let yourself sleepwalk through the years like I almost did. The call came on a scorching June afternoon as I stood among my tomato plants, garden hose in hand. My phone lit up with a text from Maria, my dearest friend from our university. Dazed. Emergency. Could Connor stay at your place this weekend? My mother fell and I need to get to Jacksonville immediately. I paused, shielding my eyes from the harsh sunlight. Connor, her son, 17 going on 18. In my memory, he was still the quiet boy who used to peek out from behind Maria's skirt during visits. Recently, though, he'd shot up past both of us, his voice settling into deeper registers, carrying himself with the confidence of emerging manhood. Naturally, I agreed. Maria had supported me through my darkest moments over the years. Watching her son for a weekend was hardly a burden. He appeared at my doorstep hours later with a faded backpack slung over his shoulder and an endearing, slightly nervous grin. "I really appreciate this, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "None of that formality," I laughed, dismissing his politeness with a wave. "You're practically grown now. Just call me Sarah." His smile widened, and something about the way his eyes lingered made my stomach flutter unexpectedly. I pushed the feeling aside. We found our groove quickly that first evening. I prepared his favorite meal, lasagna, and afterward we settled in to watch some action film he'd been wanting to see. While he sat transfixed, leaning forward with the intensity of someone searching for deeper meaning in every explosion, I found myself watching him more than the screen. Our conversation stayed surface level initially. School subjects, graduation, plans, his uncertain future. Maybe community college. Maybe moving to Oregon to work with his father's brother. There was a thoughtfulness to him that caught me off guard. He wasn't the directionless teenager I'd anticipated. Later, when I brought him fresh linens, I discovered him on the rear porch, gazing into the darkness. Crickets chirped their evening song while lightning bugs danced through the humid air. "Everything all right?" I asked softly, stepping beside him. He nodded but remained quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes I wish I could freeze moments like this," he said eventually. "Just pause everything. Do you ever feel like that?" I studied his profile in the dim light, the strong line of his jaw, the sincerity in his tone. Something in his words resonated deeply. "More often than you might imagine," I admitted quietly. When he turned to meet my gaze, I felt an unexpected shift in the air between us. Some unspoken recognition passed through the space that separated us. Then he stood, smiled, and wished me good night. I remained outside long after he'd gone in, stars overhead, trying to understand the warmth spreading through my chest. It wasn't attraction, I told myself firmly. Just appreciation, a reminder of youth, of possibilities, of being truly noticed. Saturday dawned peacefully. I made French toast while he volunteered to help organize storage boxes in the basement without being asked. We played classic rock while we worked, mostly Beatles and Stones, and I was surprised when he sang along to nearly every song. "Your musical taste is better than expected," I teased. He laughed. "That's because Mom raised me right, and she's always playing your old mixtapes." By evening we were both exhausted and sticky with sweat, so I suggested cooling off in the backyard pool. I hadn't swum in months, but the idea felt refreshing. I changed into a modest swimsuit that had been buried in my dresser, suddenly conscious of how it fit. When I stepped outside, he was already floating peacefully, eyes closed against the setting sun. He looked so serene, so comfortable in his own skin. Something inside me relaxed. "Water's perfect," he said without opening his eyes. The pool was indeed warm from the day's heat. We talked about trivial things while we floated, but then he looked at me intently and said, "You don't often let yourself be happy, do you?" I blinked in surprise. "Of course I do." He shook his head gently. "You put on happiness like makeup, but when it's genuine, it transforms your entire face." My breath caught. I laughed it off, but his observation stayed with me. The way he'd seen through my carefully constructed contentment, recognizing me not as someone's middle-aged friend or a woman whose best years were behind her, but as a complete person deserving of authentic joy. That night I lay awake, replaying our conversations and the way his attention had made me feel seen in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Something dormant was stirring to life, equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. I didn't yet understand how profoundly it would change everything. Sunday arrived with soft morning light, filtering through the trees before the sun fully emerged. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee, staring across the lawn as gentle illumination spread over everything. I kept telling myself the previous evening's emotions were just fatigue, that these unfamiliar feelings would fade with the novelty of having house guests. But when I heard his footsteps descending the staircase bare feet against hardwood, unhurried and heavy with sleep, my heart quickened despite my better judgment. This was absurd. I was 52 years old. He was barely beyond high school. I had no right to feel what I was feeling. Yet when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair tousled and eyes still soft with sleep, I found myself smiling before I could stop myself. "You're an early riser," he observed, stretching his neck. "Old habits," I replied. "Hungry? I could make some eggs." He nodded, settling at the counter while I moved around the kitchen. There was something peaceful about the routine me cooking, him watching with that attentive way that made me simultaneously nervous and curious. The quiet morning light caught the golden highlights in his hair, as ordinary sounds filled the space. The sizzle of butter in the pan, coffee percolating, birds beginning their daily chorus. When I handed him his plate, our fingers made brief contact, sending an unexpected jolt through me that I tried to hide. "You always seem so centered," he said between bites. "Is that your diplomatic way of calling me dull?" I asked lightly. "Not at all," he said quickly. "I mean, you create this sense of peace. This house feels like sanctuary when you're in it." The compliment was so genuine, so thoughtful, that it nearly undid me. I'd spent decades being the reliable one, the one who smoothed over difficulties and tucked away her own needs to avoid making others uncomfortable. Too. Hear someone say I created sanctuary. It felt like being truly recognized. After breakfast, we made no specific plans. He settled on the front porch with a book while I tackled household chores, though my mind kept wandering despite my efforts to stay focused. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered from the east, thunder rumbling ominously in the distance. Florida summer storms have a way of appearing suddenly, without much warning until they're directly overhead. We found ourselves together in the living room, as rain drummed against the windows. I lit several candles in case we lost power, and we sat at opposite ends of the couch, browsing through old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. "That's my son when he was small," I said, pointing to a picture of a little boy covered in sand, grinning at the camera. "He has your smile," Connor observed. "Same warmth in the eyes." "He's braver than I ever was," I said, more to myself than to him. Connor turned to study me. "You don't recognize your own strength." Suddenly I became aware of how close we were sitting. The couch seemed to have shrunk. There was an energy between us, subtle but unmistakable. "You remind me of someone I used to know," I said softly, unsure why I was sharing this. "Is that positive or negative?" he asked. I nodded, holding his gaze. "Positive, but it also frightens me." The silence stretched between us. Thunder rolled closer outside. He reached over and placed his hand gently over mine. "You don't need to be frightened of me," he said simply. My breathing became shallow. It would have been simple to pull away, to change the subject, to get up and busy myself with kitchen tasks or call Maria for an update. But I didn't. I sat there, letting the moment settle around us, feeling the warmth from his hand travel up my arm like a quiet invitation. I wasn't ready to accept or decline. Eventually, I did pull my hand back, not because I wanted to, but because I felt I should. I stood and went to the kitchen under the pretense of making tea, my pulse racing and thoughts scattered. I told myself this had to end here, that nothing could develop between us, that this was simply a lonely woman and a compassionate young man having their emotional signals crossed during an unusual weekend. I could still feel the imprint of his touch lingering on my skin. That night's sleep eluded me. I lay listening to rain continue falling outside, trying to convince myself that boundaries hadn't shifted, that nothing fundamental had changed. But in my heart, I knew they had, and I wasn't prepared for what that might mean, or where it might lead. By morning the storm had passed, though the air still carried that fresh, clean scent that follows rain. I stood barefoot on the porch with my coffee, watching mist rise from the lawn in the early light. Everything felt charged with possibility, like the house itself was holding its breath. Connor hadn't yet come downstairs, and I wasn't certain whether I felt relieved or disappointed. The memory of his hand covering mine remained vivid. I'd replayed it countless times during the sleepless night, each time telling myself it was meaningless until it began to mean something I couldn't ignore. When I heard his familiar footsteps, I felt that flutter of anticipation that had become so familiar. He joined me on the porch, stretching in his rumpled t-shirt that clung slightly from the humidity. He seemed more mature somehow. Or perhaps I was simply seeing him with different eyes. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Hey there." We stood in comfortable silence while birds chirped in the trees, nature having returned to normal after the storm. "Are you all right?" he asked eventually. I hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure." He nodded slowly, as if he understood something I hadn't articulated. "About yesterday, I hope I didn't cross a line," he said after a moment. "You didn't," I said too quickly, then added, "I mean, not exactly." He waited patiently for me to continue, sighed, gripping my mug more tightly. I think I'd forgotten what it feels like to be truly seen by someone. And I wasn't expecting to feel that way because of you. "I wasn't expecting it either," he said quietly. "But I did feel it. It would have been easier if he had brushed it off as kindness or confusion or youthful inexperience. But he didn't. He stood there, honest and direct, and it was that sincerity that affected me most deeply. We spent the remainder of the morning doing mundane things, shopping for groceries, folding laundry. But something had definitely shifted between us. There was a new awareness now, gentle but persistent, like an invisible thread drawing us closer with every shared glance, every accidental touch. That afternoon we found ourselves back in the living room, this time watching a quiet art film he had chosen. It was contemplative and beautiful, full of meaningful pauses and subtle gestures. Somewhere in the middle of it, he reached out and covered my hand with his again. This time I didn't move. Away, we didn't speak. We simply remained like that, hands connected, the movie's images flickering across our faces in the dim room. I could feel his pulse through his fingertips steady, warm, alive. My own hand trembled slightly, but I didn't withdraw it. Credits began rolling. He turned toward me, his eyes searching mine with quiet intensity. "Can I share something with you?" he asked. I nodded. "You're the first person in a long time who's really heard me, who hasn't treated me like I'm just some clueless teenager." I swallowed hard. "You're not clueless. I know," he said. "But you're the only one who seems to understand that." There was something achingly vulnerable in his voice, something that touched parts of me I'd kept carefully protected for years. Almost without thinking, I reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. By the time I realized what I was doing, my fingers were already there. He leaned forward slightly, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, just enough that I had to close my eyes for a moment to steady myself. But then I stood. Abruptly, I should start thinking about dinner, I said, my voice unsteady. He didn't try to stop me. He just sat there, watching me walk away with an expression I couldn't quite read. In the kitchen, I gripped the counter edge, heart pounding hard against my ribs. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He was leaving tomorrow. Maria would return. Life would resume its familiar, predictable patterns. And yet something inside me felt permanently altered, like a door had been opened that couldn't be closed again. That evening, after dinner, he offered to help with the dishes. I stood beside him, drying as he washed, our movements deliberate and unhurried. When we finished, he turned to face me directly. "Thank you," he said with quiet intensity. "For what?" "For this, for being exactly who you are." I didn't know how to respond to such raw honesty. Instead, I reached up and touched his cheek just once. Just briefly. In that instant, I understood this wasn't really about age or social conventions or even physical attraction. It was about being seen, being valued, being understood in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. It was both terrifying and beautiful. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. After Connor had gone upstairs, I remained alone in the living room, with the lights dimmed low, the house filled with the particular stillness that comes in the deep hours of early morning. I curled up on the couch with a soft blanket, staring into the middle distance as my thoughts moved like thick honey, too substantial to fight, but impossible to organize. I kept returning to everything that had unfolded over these few days. Quiet conversations, the long looks, the words that seemed to hover in the air long after they were spoken. None of it had been planned or expected, and yet all of it had felt surprisingly genuine. I'd been existing quietly for years. My divorce had been civil but emotionally barren. The children had grown up and built their own lives, and I'd constructed a routine that felt safe and structured. I'd even managed to convince myself that safety was enough. Until now. It was nearly 2:30 a.m. when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. He paused at the entrance to the room, his presence soft but unmistakable. "Couldn't sleep either," he said quietly. "No." He sat down beside me, careful to maintain some distance. His voice was gentle in the darkness. "I leave tomorrow." "I know." There was a long pause filled only with the soft sounds of the house settling around us. "I don't want this to be something we both pretend never happened," he said finally. I turned to look at him then. "We haven't really done anything, haven't we?" he said, meeting my eyes. "Even without touching, you feel it too, don't you?" I looked away, but silence can be its own form of honesty. "I do," I whispered finally. "But feeling something doesn't mean we should act on it." "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "I just ... I don't want to be the only one who felt a connection here." "You weren't," I admitted. The quiet stretched between us again. Outside, wind had picked up, rustling through the trees. A branch tapped gently against the window glass, a soft reminder that time continued moving forward, despite our desire to pause it. He reached out slowly, and this time I didn't hesitate. I let his hand find mine without resistance. This wasn't about romance or crossing forbidden boundaries. It was about human connection, about being present with another person who understood loneliness, about two people who had found unexpected comfort in each other's company during a weekend that had become something neither of us anticipated. We sat like that for quite a while, no words, no expectations, just the simple presence of being understood. Eventually, I let my head rest against his shoulder. I didn't know what it signified for the future. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew this feeling would stay with me for a very long time. The next morning brought cooler, clearer air. We said our goodbyes without drama or grand gestures. He hugged me firmly, longer than might have been typical, and I held on just as tightly. "Thank you," he said one more time. "For what?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. For seeing me as I actually am. As I watched him walk down the driveway to where Maria's car was waiting, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and peace. Maria waved cheerfully from the driver's seat, completely unaware of what had passed between us during these few days, and that seemed appropriate somehow. I returned to the house, which felt more silent than it had before his arrival. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting on the back deck with tea, letting the sun warm my face. I allowed the quiet to wash over me completely. Maybe nothing would come of this experience. Maybe it was just a moment, a weekend, a gentle spark in an otherwise steady chapter of my life. That maybe it was something more significant than that. I had spent so many years believing that love only arrived in predictable forms, that after reaching a certain age, your heart stopped surprising you with new possibilities. Now I understood how wrong I'd been. We don't always choose when we awaken to new feelings, or who helps us awaken. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters are the ones that remind us we're still fully alive, still capable of deep feeling, still worthy of being truly seen and valued. The weekend had ended, but something in me had just begun.